first question that one wants to answer in macroeconomics is, what determines the total output of an economy? Why do some countries produce a lot and other countries produce so little? What determines the standard of living of a country? Let's start off with a definition. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a given period. Let's just call it total output. GDP per capita is that total output divided by the country's population. And that is the standard measure of how well off a country is, the standard of living of a country's residents. It varies greatly across countries, from a few hundred US$ per year for GDP per capita to over 100,000 in other countries. In Jamaica, for example, it's about 9,000 US$ a year. In the United States, it's 57,000 US$ a year. So their typical citizen is several times wealthier than Jamaicans, has several times the level of income annually. In China, it's $15,000 a year. Up until recently, China was actually poorer, had a lower per capita GDP than Jamaica. They have had a rapid economic growth and have surpassed Jamaica and gone some ways ahead. Near the other end of the scale, Somalia has a GDP per capita of $400 a year. Near the top is Norway, $69,000 a year. So the point is that there's a great variety of outcomes in terms of GDP and GDP per capita. Some countries are far more productive than others. And we want to understand in this section why that is so. Here's how we're going to think about it. Let us consider a person standing in a barren field. He has no education. He has no tools or equipment. All he has is a barren piece of land and his physical capability. That person is not going to be very productive. If he has to create the means of his own sustenance, if he has to produce, he's not going to be very productive. So the question is, what does it take to raise that person's productivity? What are the building blocks of productivity? First one is capital. If we give him some capital, that is going to increase his productivity. There are two kinds of capital. There's physical capital, tools, equipment, buildings. All of those raise the productivity of an empty-handed man. There's also human capital. That refers to the knowledge and skills. Capital inside a person's head. Knowledge about production can raise the productivity of that productive action just as much as tools can. We treat physical capital and human capital in the same way because they share two key similarities. One is that both of them raise productivity. If he's going to grow more food, then we can either give him tools to grow food with, a shovel, a fork, an irrigation system, or we can give him knowledge of agriculture. And that will allow him to plant the right crops for the soil and climate and the rainfall, and knowing what depth and spacing to use. And those two will raise his yield. So we treat physical capital and human capital in the same way. Secondly, both of them can be invested in. You can produce physical capital and you can create and learn knowledge. Both of them are investable. Second building block of productivity. The second factor that is going to raise the productivity of our man standing in the barren field is technology. Methods and organization of production. When we talk about technology in this context, we are using it in a slightly different way from how the term technology is used in everyday language. People think of technology as gadgetry. The best way for us to illustrate productive technology in the context of economics is to go back to what is certainly the most famous economics book ever written, published in 1776, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And the key passage is when he talks about a pin factory that he has recently visited. To take an example, he writes, from the trade of the pin maker, a workman could scarce, perhaps, with his utmost industry, make 1 pin in a day, and certainly could not make 20. But in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, by which he means a specialized trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise specialized trades, specialist activities. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. That is the packaging. And the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind, Adam Smith writes, where 10 men only were employed. But though they were very poor, and therefore but indifferently accommodated with the necessary machinery. And when he writes indifferently accommodated, he's saying they only had the basic tools necessary for pin making. They had the wire cutters, they had the hammers, they had the pliers, because only with basic tools, though they were indifferently accommodated with the necessary tools, they could, among them, make upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. Each person, therefore, might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently, each one working on the whole pin by himself, they certainly could not each of them have made 20. Adam Smith is describing a situation where If each man were working on his own, he could not make 20 pins in a day. But by reorganizing how the production is done with the same number of persons and the same tools, by reorganizing so that each person specializes in a part of the production process, division of labor, then on average, each person can be associated with 4,800 pins in a day. Adam Smith is making the point that merely by reorganizing the factory space using division of labor, productivity goes from perhaps 20 pins a day to 4,800. This is what we mean by technology. Technology, in our context, is simply how production is carried out. It has nothing to do with having more advanced tools. How the activity you want is organized is the technology of production. And the example of the pin factory illustrates that some technologies of production are more productive, far more productive than others. And there are many examples. One way to procure food was exhibited throughout history by hunter-gatherer societies. They go out into the landscape and they pick whatever is growing and kill whatever they need. Another way to procure food is by planting and harvesting. Agriculture. The technology of agriculture is more productive than the technology of hunting and gathering. In the area of car manufacturing, cars can be produced with a lot of manual labor and less capital, or it can be produced with very little manual labor and having robots doing a lot of the welding and assembling and screwing together. If you want to correspond with somebody who is not in your immediate vicinity, there is the technology of physical mail, where you write your message on a piece of paper, and through a chain of hand delivery, it ends up being delivered to the addressee. Another technology is electronic mail, where it goes through the nodes and connections of the internet. So these are just all examples of using different technologies to achieve the same end. And some technologies are more productive than others. Sometimes the difference in the technology is small, and it makes a big difference. In 1995, I visited the Partagas cigar factory in Havana, Cuba. And there you had rows and rows of workers cutting the tobacco and rolling it into cigars. This is generally quite tedious work. At one end of the giant factory floor was a man sitting at a microphone, and his job was to read stories to the workers. He was reading from a book, from a novel, so that the workers would have something to listen to and not get too bored. This, it was discovered, raised the productivity of cigar making. So instead of having yet another person on the factory floor rolling cigars, they found it to be more productive to have one less person on the factory floor, use that person to read novels to the other workers. And the gain in productivity overall was greater than the loss of one extra person rolling cigars. That was a change of technology that raised productivity. So when we talk about the technology of production, separate that idea from the machinery in which the technology might be embodied. In many cases, in the case of automobile manufacturing, we saw that sometimes a different technology requires different machinery. Sometimes it requires more advanced machinery because the technology is actually embodied in the machinery. But conceptually, we want to keep those two separate. The method of production, the way production is organized, keep that separate from the capital in which the different technology might be embodied. The third building block of productivity, the third factor that causes people to be more or less productive is institutions in which that production takes place. The laws, rules, and the norms of a society that govern its commercial activity. Those rules and norms might have their origin in culture and religion, or it might come from written down laws and regulations, or it might just be the habits and practices of a particular society. For example, until recently, women weren't allowed to drive legally in Saudi Arabia. As you can imagine, this would have a dampening effect on productivity. One thing, it creates an obstacle for women to get to work. It's not worthwhile having a job if by the time you have to pay a male driver to take you to and from work, you have too little left over, then you may as well stay home. When a couple of years ago, this restriction was lifted and women were allowed to drive, then it made modestly paying jobs far more accessible and far more worth the while for women. So that raised the society's productivity. This is an example of a cultural barrier, a cultural practice and institution that was limiting the productivity of that economy. So the rules that govern economic activity are going to impact productivity. Let's look at what are the main institutional factors that are relevant to how productive an economy can be. At the top of that list would be secure private property rights. We take property rights for granted. You know, property can be owned. You get a title to land, and you want that property right to be secure. That if you own a resource or you own a TV set, that you have a reasonable expectation of continuing to own it the following week or month or year, that it's not going to get stolen. But property rights can't be taken for granted. There's a great story to illustrate this that comes from a book, Why Nations Fail, by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. And he talks about the example of Stephen Sonjika, who is from the Ciskei in South Africa. And in an address about 100 years ago, Sonjika noted how when he first expressed to his father, a Bantu tribal chief, that his desire was to buy some land, his father responded, "Buy land? How can you want to buy land? All land is God's, and he gave it to the chiefs only to administer." So in that society of the tribal chief, the idea that one could have rights to property, to land, was unknown. The concept of private property rights did not exist. So private property rights are important, and important to productivity because it gives an incentive for people to want to invest in and develop property. And once you have a right to property, it has to be secure. So widespread predial larceny and insecurity does not lead people to being very productive. Another example, another institutional factor that is important to productivity is that there exists a speedy and trusted judicial system. This is important for contract enforcement. A lot of economic activity is not simultaneous in terms of costs and benefits. You know, when you go to the shop to buy a loaf of bread, then loaf of bread and the money to pay for the bread are simultaneous actions. That does not require any kind of trust. It doesn't require any kind of contract. But a lot of high value economic activity requires that costs be incurred before the benefits are felt. So for example, when you want to contract somebody to build a house, and on both sides of that transaction, costs are incurred before the house is delivered and finally paid for. So a lot of value creation requires a level of trust or some trust mechanism between the two transacting parties. And that requires a contract. And the contract is only meaningful to the extent that there's a judicial system that can enforce it in case there's a breach. A speedy and trusted judicial system is an important institution in economic development. Merit-based decision-making. Are decisions based on merit? Are economic decisions who to buy from, who to sell to, who to hire, who to promote, who to be given credit, who to get economic opportunities? Are those based strictly on merit, or is it based on class, caste, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation? All of those factors can lead decisions to be made in ways that are not the most productive, that don't lead to the highest productivity. A society that practices and celebrates merit-based decision-making tends to have higher levels of productivity. Accountable governance are those that have state power, those who govern accountable for their mistakes and missteps. If they're accountable, then one is likely to have fewer mistakes and missteps and corruption, and therefore more likely to have a governing framework that facilitates production. So these are just some of the most important institutional factors that affect productivity. There are others. So if we want our, bare-handed man standing in a barren field to be able to produce more, to have a high level of productivity, we need to give him capital, tools, buildings, knowledge. We need to have him deploy the best technology of production, and he needs to be operating in a context of institutions that facilitate production. In an economy, the amount of capital, the level of technology, and the facilitation of institutions determines the economy's normal productive capacity. That is the base level of an economy's production. We may say an economy's normal capacity level of output rests upon its institutions, technology, and capital. Normal capacity level of output has a few euphemisms. It is sometimes called the full employment level of output or the cyclically adjusted level of output. This is in some sense the mean of an economy's output. Now, an economy can in any given year can produce less than that because of particular circumstances. Perhaps a pandemic comes along and makes people less productive for a time, and the economy goes into a slump. An economy can also produce above its normal capacity level of output. You can also have circumstances where resources and capacity is strained beyond its normal levels to produce more. That's called a boom. And what we actually see is that over time, an economy's actual level of output from year to year fluctuates around this normal capacity level. The economy has cyclical fluctuations around its normal or trend level of output. But if we are talking about what is the country's standard of living, then we need to focus on that capacity level of output that is determined by those three building blocks. So we conclude that a country's standard of living is determined by the productivity of its people, and that in turn depends on the amount of capital, level of technology, and the facilitation of its institutions.